All right, so good evening. I'm Ezekiel Dixon Roman, Associate Professor in the School of Social Policy and Practice and Faculty Affiliate at the Center for Africana Studies here at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome to this first program in our Spring New Directions and Afro-Latinx Studies series, which highlights the most vibrant and current scholarship in Latinx studies. It is my great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Amarilys Estrella, who will present the talk titled Muertes Civiles and the Possibility of Life, Human Rights Activism Against Racism in the Dominican Republic. Dr. Amarilys Estrella is an assistant professor of anthropology and a faculty affiliate for the Center for African and African American Studies and the Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Rice University. She holds a PhD in sociocultural anthropology and a master's in Latin America and Caribbean studies from New York University. Her research interests broadly focus on the intersections of race and gender within transnational movements, Black Latin American and Latinx identity, as well as human rights and anti-racist activism. Her first book project investigates how Blackness and Black identity is produced, employed, and transformed through everyday encounters among stateless Black grassroots activists of Haitian descent in the Dominican Republic. Dr. Estrella is currently working on an edited book volume with Dr. Melissa Maldonado Salcero, which seeks to explore and engage the many voices of mujerismos, disrupting the silences and making visible the ways in which genealogies of power get mapped through and because of the body. She is also a founding member of We Are All Dominican, a collective of graduate students, educators, scholars, activists, artists, activists, and community members of Dominican and Haitian descent who joined forces in October 2013 to denounce the Dominican Constitutional Tribunal's decision TC-0168/13, which stripped the nationality of more than 4 generations of Dominicans of Haitian descent. Following the lecture, we will have time for Amarilys to answer questions from the audience. Please feel free to type your questions in the question and answer box at any time during her presentation. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Amarilys Estrella.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon Roman, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the warm welcome, and thank you as well to the Center for Africana Studies at UPenn for the invitation to be part of the New Directions in Afro-Latinx Studies series. So today I will be, let me share my screen first before I start. So let me just get that going.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
And of course, Siri thinks I'm talking to Siri.
I'm not sure I understand.
Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen now. And so let's get started. So today I will be speaking about my first book project, which is based on 2 years of ethnographic research in the Dominican Republic, including archival research, participant observation, and interviews with Black Dominican activists of Haitian descent who have been rendered stateless in the Dominican Republic. And as Dr. Dixon Roman mentioned, for the past 8.5 years, I have also been organizing with the Dominican and Haitian diaspora through We Are All Dominican, which seeks to amplify the voices of Dominicans of Haitian descent. And being part of We're All Dominican has really shaped the research and writing that I have done over the past 8.5 years. So even though I won't touch on it much during the talk, I hope that during the Q&A session, we have some time to discuss it further. So for today's talk, I will begin by providing an overview of my larger book project, followed by some historical context on ruling 168-13, which is often referred to as La Sentencia. And the ruling itself is the ruling that denationalized Black Dominicans of Haitian descent in the Dominican Republic. And at that point, I will also provide an overview of the Reconocido movement. I will then provide an explanation of the term muertes civiles, which means civil deaths in English, as well as the terms zombie and ghosts, which speak to the kinds of deaths stateless individuals are facing. But what I really want to touch on is this idea of the possibility of life in engaging with the ghosts and zombies. I also want to explore the possibility of life through analysis of the term reandando, which I have translated into English as returning during the process of death, and the possibilities that emerge out of the many ways in which movement members are experiencing spiritual and physical returns to their communities as activists. And finally, I'll end with just a few points on future directions for my research. So my larger book project examines how Blackness and Black identities are produced, employed, and transformed through everyday encounters among Black activists of the Reconocido movement, who seek to build a large-scale transnational human rights movement against racism. By examining how Dominican activists of Haitian descent are mobilizing human rights and providing new symbolic meaning to Blackness beyond their geographical limitations, I highlight how human rights activists' negotiation of the conditions of their everyday lives and work provides new ways of imagining global social justice as ideology and practice. So I ask, how are Dominican activists of Haitian descent translating global understandings of Blackness and anti-Black racism in order to address the particularities of their communities in which racial discrimination, gender, and Blackness become conduits for the denial of citizenship? So through an analysis of the Reconocido movement's activism, my larger book project highlights the limitations of human rights as a legal and discursive framework in the development of emancipatory projects focused on Black liberation. Ultimately, this project is about the different forms of deaths experienced by Black people on a global scale and the possibilities that emerge in the process of reimagining liberation. Today, I will be presenting just one part of that research, focusing on the fifth and final chapter of my book. I engaged Christina Sharp's analysis of wake work in order to examine what Sharp refers to as Black people's ability to, and I quote, everywhere and anywhere produce in, into, and through the wake an insistence on existing, end quote. Sharp employs wake work, and I quote again, as a conceptual frame of and for living Blackness in the diaspora in the still unfolding aftermaths of Atlantic chattel slavery, end quote. So I position this project in Reconocido's activism within the wake and wake work that allows for the interpretation of the movement's different manifestations of resistance to death by racism. I argue that through this wake work analytic, Reconocido is imagining new ways of living despite Black death. So to begin, I'd like to provide some historical context on Haitian migration to the Dominican Republic and how this led to the present-day anti-racist activism of movements such as Reconocido in response to La Sentencia. So Sidney Mint states that for the Caribbean as a whole, the steady demand overall and for most epochs has been for sugar. The quest for sugar was sustained through colonization and the proliferation of the transatlantic slave trade beginning in the 16th century. The enduring legacy of colonialism and its intimate connection to imperial aspirations can be traced 4 centuries later to the United States occupation of the Dominican Republic between 1916 and 1924. During this period, which saw the end of World War I and the destruction of Europe's sugar beet industry, the United States established sugar plantations in the Dominican Republic. In these sugar plantations, the large-scale recruitment of Haitian temporary guest workers began. Despite measures to restrict the number of Black migrants into the country, the practice of hiring temporary guest workers remained in place through formal contracts between the Haitian and Dominican governments throughout the remainder of the 20th century. While the majority of guest workers would return to Haiti after the season's harvest, a small number remained in the sugar company's compounds known as batalles, where they eventually settled and many of their children were born. Until January of 2010, when a new constitution was promulgated, every one of the Dominican's constitutions since 1844 guaranteed birthright citizenship to anyone born within its borders. The exception to this rule were the children of diplomats and people who weren't in transit, which was understood until 2004 as someone who was in the country for less than 10 days. Upon the birth of their Dominican-born children, many Haitian guest workers registered their children with the Junta Central Electoral, also known as the Central Electoral Board, and I'll refer to it from now on as JCE. And they were able to register their children with their temporary guest worker identification cards, also referred to as the ficha. It was common practice for Haitian migrants who had settled in the country to use this form of identification for all their administrative and commercial transactions. It was not until the late 1980s and 90s that Dominican civil registry officials began to systematically deny the registration of children of Haitian ancestry by challenging the validity of the ficha as sufficient for these purposes. I also want to note that while the use of the ficha was a common practice, it was also common for children born in rural areas and impoverished communities to not be registered until several months or even years after their birth. During the 80s and 90s, a changing economy meant a decline in the Dominican sugar industry, an increase in neoliberal policies that led to the privatization of government services, and an increased emphasis on the tourism and textiles industry. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, the formerly public sugar industry was privatized, ending the formal agreements between Haiti and the Dominican Republic for temporary guest workers. The resulting physical marginalization experienced by Haitian immigrants living in rural areas was met by an increased need for their children to find alternative forms of employment. Often this meant leaving the sugarcane fields their parents once worked in for nearby towns and urban centers, such as the capital city of Santo Domingo. These internal flows of migration from rural areas toward town and urban centers were occurring on a wide scale. The physical presence of Black working class Dominicans of Haitian descent in urban centers, often equated with Dominican modernity and cosmopolitanism, raised the question for the Dominican state of whether their Haitian ancestry could allow them to be the rightful heirs of the Dominican nation. The right to citizenship by birth, often referred to as jus solis, as opposed to heritage-based citizenship, jus sanguinis, became highly contested. So in 2013, the Dominican Republic's Constitutional Tribunal denationalized more than 4 generations of Dominicans of Haitian descent, which officially rendered stateless individuals who had been previously legally recognized by the Dominican government. By claiming that the children of undocumented Haitian migrants were not entitled to birthright citizenship, the Dominican Constitutional Tribunal's ruling 168-13, also known as La Sentencia, cemented a decades-long process of denying darker-skinned, Haitian-looking individuals the right to vote, work, legally wed, or purchase homes. Black Dominicans of Haitian descent active in the Reconocido movement often state that these denationalization policies have caused their civil deaths, or muertes civiles. Reconocido, which means recognized in Spanish, and also refers to the URL for the movement's online page, as you can see here on this slide, has organized and trained themselves to fight against their figurative deaths, and yet are often plagued with the literal deaths of the movement's members and their families. The struggles are not only a fight for legal recognition, but also survival in the context of higher rates of death as a direct result of systemic racism that excludes Black Dominicans of Haitian descent from the Dominican state. Founded in 2011, Reconocido is considered the first organized movement led by young Black Dominicans of Haitian descent that are resisting a series of denationalization policies and rulings. Reconocido would often explain that they were really the first movement in large numbers, where you had the individuals who were directly impacted at the forefront. And that in itself makes them unique and key organizers. They saw their work as long-term and transformational, and were committed to the political education of their members and the communities that they came from and worked in. The Reconocido movement was organized into zones comprised of several nuclei, which were responsible for organizing communities within the 6 different regions of the country where they worked. So in this image here, you can see there are dots that are marking the different areas of the country in the south, southeast, where the Reconocido movement is organizing. The movement was led by a small committee, and they're referred to as the Petit Comité. And the Petit Comité was responsible for the day-to-day work of the movement at the national level. And this small committee was responsible for budgeting, as well as the development of yearly calendar activities, which included organizing national coordination meetings, as well as community meetings to discuss denationalization policies and statelessness. They were also responsible for external affairs, including regularly scheduled meetings with international supporters and national level ally organizations. This image here is just one example of a meeting with a national level organization to discuss health. Additionally, Reconocido participated in the organization of mass rallies to make visible the number of stateless individuals. As you can see here, these are images from the 2016 rally that was held in front of the JCE. Reconocido was also actively involved in international and regional court cases and hearings in the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and organized transnational meetings with Afro-descendant movements throughout the Latin American region to raise awareness and develop anti-racist strategies in unison. And this here is an image of their participation at the hearings on statelessness and human rights defenders in Panama City in 2016 as well. But the bulk of the members' time, however, was spent accompanying Dominicans of Haitian descent to government offices, which were responsible for their civil deaths by denying them their identity documents. Reconocidos members accompanied mothers with newborn children to hospitals where the management had denied them a white paper certificate confirming the child's birth and Dominican nationality. They were fighting against the common practice of providing the child with a pink paper certificate that would label the child a foreigner. And here's just one image of what the pink paper certificate looks like. So this certificate was necessary in order to register the child's birth with the local offices of the JCE. Reconocido also accompanied young Black Dominicans of Haitian descent to the JCE, where they were often denied copies of birth certificates or national identification cards by administrative officials who had flagged what they referred to as strange sounding last names or French sounding last names. Reconocidos leaders were well known in their communities and often expressed a great sense of responsibility over the lives of their members, family, and community. In addition to their core work demanding that the Dominican nationality be restored, Reconocidos leaders became known in their communities as resources for issues beyond documentation. They supported their elders in advocating for their pension funds as retired sugarcane workers and accompanied the sick and injured to hospitals. They organized community cleanup days, fundraising events, and movie nights. It was in this context that I first came to conduct research and support the work of Reconocido. And it is within this context that on one particular morning, when I'm working with Minerva, the coordinator at that time, and she's telling me about all of the deaths that have been happening within the movement. And she states, lately there are a lot of deaths. Every week there are deaths. And she had made these remarks after a week full of the news of death, including that of the movement's treasurer's father. And the movement treasurer's name was Julio, and Julio's father was a diabetic who had migrated to the Dominican Republic 25 years earlier to work in the sugarcane fields. Julio's father had just returned home to Haiti for the first time and passed away during his visit. Julio's father was buried in Haiti, never again to be seen by Julio, because Julio did not have the necessary means to cross the border without risking his return home to the Dominican Republic. The physical death of individuals who were close to the movement, such as Julio's father, were usually discussed in passing during Reconocido's meeting breaks, when they would have fundraisers to provide financial support for the families of the deceased. During the scheduled meetings, though, the movement prioritized what they considered to be the more pressing matters and its primary goal, which was to address the civil genocide they were facing as the children of Haitian migrants. So for Reconocido, a civil genocide meant the en masse erasure of their Dominican nationality as and rights as citizens. Reconocido often used the term muerte civil to describe the way in which the Dominican government had rendered them stateless. When asking Reconocido members what civil death meant to them, they often describe feeling like ghosts, or as one leader explained, and I'm quoting here, the Dominican government has turned us into zombies like the ones from the AMC television series, The Walking Dead, who don't exist for the educational system, the health system, or the formal economy, end quote. As stateless individuals, Black Dominicans of Haitian descent were not legally recognized by the Dominican government and were often stripped of or denied identity documents. They were vulnerable to racial profiling by immigration officials who would demand ID cards, and in some documented cases, were expelled to Haiti if they did not provide the required documents. Oftentimes, Reconocidos leaders discussed how they felt as if they did not belong in either country. They referred to themselves as zombies because they did not exist legally and were not allowed access to government services. Yet their physical presence as Black individuals made them highly visible, undesirable, and dangerous within a Dominican society that had marked them as Haitian and did not accept their claims to Dominican identity. So I want to turn now to talk about these physical deaths the movement was experiencing. Reconocido spent long hours in community and national level meetings discussing advocacy and legal strategies to fight against their symbolic death. During manifestations held in front of the JCE headquarters, Reconocido would often bring a coffin symbolizing their deaths as Dominican nationals. Upon observing and participating in Reconocido's work, however, it quickly became evident that the struggle and figurative deaths they were experiencing went far beyond identity documents. Their struggles were also for the right to survive within a Dominican society whose rejection of them for being children of Black Haitian migrants had become lethal. Although Reconocido's meeting agendas prioritized the development of strategies to fight against the erasure of Dominican citizens, they were inevitably tasked with the development of everyday practices of resistance for their corporeal survival. Reconocido's struggle against their muertes civiles was inextricably linked to their daily struggles and resistance against a government that was equally invested in their physical deaths. Not only are Black people in places like the Dominican Republic more vulnerable to violent deaths due to structural racism, but they're also more likely to die because, as Arzami Burton notes, and I'm quoting here, race impacts the quality of air we breathe, the levels of toxins we're exposed to, the quality of food we have access to, and the likelihood that we will develop chronic diseases such as asthma, diabetes, heart disease, cancers, and HIV, end quote. It is no surprise then that Black Dominicans of Haitian descent living in sugarcane communities have the highest rates of chronic malnutrition in the Dominican Republic. Approximately 80.9% of the children of migrants, of which the majority are of Haitian descent, do not have access to health insurance. So one of the most recent deaths that I want to talk about within the Reconocido movement was Miriam. And Miriam was actively involved in the movement for many years. Most recently, Miriam had joined the Reconocido's Muñecas Negras project, Black Dolls in English. And this space was created so that women could come together, women of the movement, to share their experiences, including their intimate encounters with administrative officials in hospitals who refused to acknowledge their Dominican identity. They shared their experiences of discriminatory practices based on their skin color and hair texture, all while sharing laughs and reimagining themselves through the creation of Black dolls. They welcomed Black women visiting from Puerto Rico and forged ties with an Afro-Brazilian teacher who identified the value in providing these workshops for women who she saw herself reflected in. For many of the women in the movement, it was an opportunity to interrogate what it means for them to live as Black Dominican women of Haitian descent in the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic, a state in which the remnants of a colonial past, as Dixa Ramirez has noted, continue to perpetuate a patriarchal culture imbricated in questions of race and gender. Through these interrogations, the women of the movement were engaging in wake work. In Christina Sharp's words, and I quote, "Through this gathering, this collecting, and reading, the women of the movement were plotting, mapping, and collecting the archives of the everyday of Black immanent and imminent death, and tracking the ways we resist, rupture, and disrupt the imminence and imminence aesthetically and materially," end quote. So I sat next to Minerva one day while she stitched together a Black doll and talked about Miriam. Minerva remembered how she and Miriam had been two of the three women arrested during one of their first public demonstrations. Even though Miriam had been ill for some time, she continued to participate in the Black Dolls project. Minerva had missed the funeral, but in remembrance of Miriam, the group had created a space during their Saturday workshops to memorialize her. They sang songs to remember her and created a doll, which they named Miriam. Christina Sharp asked, and I quote, "What does it mean to defend the dead?" End quote. Reconocido's activism and care for their dead exemplify what Sharp refers to as the praxis of the wake and wake work. Despite the necropolitics of the state, Black Dominican activists of Haitian descent have carved out spaces in Sharp's words, and I quote, "to care for, comfort, and defend those already dead, those dying, and those living consigned to the possibility of always imminent death," end quote. It is this wake work that leads the members of Reconocido to cumplir with the dead. There's no translation of for cumplir, but it marks a sense of commitment to the dead, a fulfillment of a promise that challenges the state's control over their legal and corporeal existence. It is a sense of commitment to the dead and dying that leads the Black Dominican activists of Haitian descent from the Reconocido movement to continuously fight back against these imminent deaths. So in this next part of my talk, I'm going to highlight how ghosts and zombies emerge not only as a symbol of civil death, but also as entities that embody the possibility of life. So ghosts, zombies, and the possibility of life. Kristen Smith highlights the inability of global epistemological frameworks to locate Black people within the realm of the human. This ontological refusal of Black humanity pushes the debate beyond a question of citizenship and state recognition. Smith argues, and I quote, that Black people become conceptually distant from citizenship in the popular imagination because they are ghosts, invisible subjects relegated to the realm of either the dead or the non-human, end quote. Black Dominicans of Haitian descent often refer to themselves as zombies and ghosts. These metaphors were often employed when discussing how their lives had been paralyzed or suspended as they waited for their identity documents to be returned. The zombie is someone who has lost their soul, trapped in a body that has lost all autonomy. Jennifer Rutherford historically positions zombies within Haiti and explains that becoming a zombie requires living death. And I quote, once zombified, the victim is permanently exiled from society, dead to all prior relations, and bound over to toil endlessly, casting them back into the abjection of the slave condition. Thus, the zombie is a figure that doubles the trauma of the past. It signifies a past that awaits, a past to which one can always be returned if, through transgression, one loses the right to being an individuated subject in a free society, end quote. So to be a zombie or ghost is haunting. In thinking about the zombie, I cannot help but hear the fear that such a figure has on Black Dominicans of Haitian descent. They are children of Haitian migrants who have grown up hearing these stories, but in many ways, they're also thinking about the zombies their parents have been turned into through their ceaseless toiling on Dominican sugarcane plantations. The same ceaseless toiling that many of their enslaved ancestors had also been subjected to. As a Black activist of Haitian descent explained during a conversation, it was cheaper for the Dominican government to let Haitian guest workers stay on the sugar plantations than to pay for their repatriation home. While the Dominican government sought to whiten the Dominican population through a series of policies, there were also economic interests at hand that demanded the availability of cheap labor. Amelia Hinson describes the extralegal practices implemented by the Dominican authorities that coerced Haitian migrants into remaining or relocating to sugar plantations during the 1930s and 40s. Hinson notes that by withholding immigration documents, the Dominican government sought to make sugar plantations the only legal spaces for Haitians to reside and work. Passports and other forms of identity documents became part of what Simone Brown refers to, and I quote, as the racializing surveillance apparatus that allowed for the reification of race, which in turn led to discriminatory and violent treatment, end quote. The sugar plantations symbolized spaces of political, economic, and social enclosure for Haitian migrants and their descendants. According to Samuel Martinez, beginning in the 1970s, human rights institutions began to take note of the human rights violations against Haitian migrant workers in the Dominican Republic. The social conditions in which many migrants working as sugarcane cutters found themselves in led these human rights advocates to refer to the situation as de facto slavery. Michelle Rolfe-Trouillot describes slavery as, and I quote, a ghost, both the past and a living presence, something that is and yet is not, end quote. Batallas and sugarcane plantations where time becomes suspended are representative of these hauntings. The state machinery that has turned their parents and ancestors into zombies is now trying to do the same to them. While at times the references made to zombies by members of the movement and Dominicans of Haitian descent seem more closely related to American zombie films and programs that have made zombies fixtures of popular culture, they were also closely tied to the stories many Black Dominicans of Haitian descent learned about through their parents and great-grandparents. I once asked Minerva to explain why she referred to another member of the group as a zombie. Her voice hinted at a slight nervousness that seemed to have been prompted by my question. She gave my question some thought and then answered, in our Haitian culture, they are beings that exist only corporeally, not in spirit because they have taken everything that he has inside. They are directed by others. In other words, they go where they are taken. In other words, a stronger force. And they are beings that do not govern themselves. They are beings that exist and don't exist. As Dominicans of Haitian descent, we exist, but we don't exist legally, end quote. As stateless Black individuals, Dominicans of Haitian descent live with the possibility of being forever relegated to what Orlando Patterson has referred to as social death, a condition of physical, psychological, and cultural alienation that affected the enslaved and, many would argue, continues to claim Black lives. And yet, as Patterson notes, social death, and I quote, could coexist with agency, cultural creativity, and the occasional rebellion. end quote. Despite Reconocido's use of ghosts and zombies to symbolize their civil deaths, these metaphors also signify the possibility of life. There are ghosts and zombies who are not dead. There is the chance if one is recognized as a zombie, the person does not have to stay in that state. Zombies can still be recognized. The zombie then symbolizes a return to a traumatic past, while also allowing for a different future. As Aisha Khan notes, and I quote, "The Caribbean space of death is on the one hand viewed as a site of death in the literal terms of genocide, labor abuse, and disease. On the other hand, it is viewed as a site of life in the metaphorical terms of regeneration, continuation, and constancy, as it takes on other forms of being and diverse modes of interaction," end quote. The possibility for regeneration has led many of the movement's leaders to ask what would happen if they all received their national ID cards and were recognized by the government as Dominican citizens. Would the anti-Blackness and anti-Haitian sentiment they experienced vanish? Would they no longer be deemed suspicious at security checkpoints and asked to present their documentation? Would the physical and emotional trauma they had experienced suddenly disappear? These were the questions that lingered after Reconocido's community meetings. These questions became part of Reconocido's wake work analytic. Their experiences as non-citizen subjects exemplified the afterlife of slavery. These interrogations, however, sought to rupture and imagine otherwise. The leadership of Reconocido began to discuss more explicitly how racial discrimination extended beyond citizenship. The lack of recognition as Black Dominicans of Haitian descent meant that they would continue to be seen as stateless subjects if they did not continue their anti-racist activism. During a community meeting, Angela, one of the movement's leaders, shared with a group of members that the movement's struggle went beyond national identity documents. She stated, "Our sense of struggle must continue. We must continue to join forces for what is coming. La sentencia was like an open sore, something that came as a virus to bring us down. But today, we do not allow ourselves to be so easily trampled. Today, I can say my last name is Pie, and I do not feel embarrassed, or be embarrassed that my mom goes outside with a head wrap, or to speak Haitian Creole in public. Do not faint, do not get tired. Reconocido's the body, and we the members are its organs," end quote. In other words, Reconocido was the embodiment of their struggle. Each member of the movement, imagined by Angela as the organs, played a vital role in the movement. The survival of the movement depended on the well-being and involvement of all its members. They could not have resisted and fought back against the state if it were not for the life each one of them breathed into the movement symbolized as the body. As individuals, they would have faced certain literal and figurative death. As a movement of more than 500 members, they were resisting and surviving. The members of the Reconocido movement breathed life into the movement and allowed it to take on the full human form with the colonialist epistemological legacy of liberal conceptions of the human, in Sylvia Winter's words, and thus the Dominican state wanted to deny them. The movement has supported them in their quest for the Dominican identity documents, but has also helped them through the physical and psychological effects of this war on their bodies and communities. Reconocido had emboldened its members enough to no longer fear speaking Haitian Creole in public and to be proud of their history, connecting their current and future struggles to that of their Haitian ancestors. Accessing identity documents had only been one step along the way toward their path toward full recognition. The Dominican government could not provide healing from the psychological trauma they had faced. The members' active participation in the movement facilitated this form of healing. These acts of resistance were often not told by Reconocido's network of transnational supporters. The need to speak about their own stories of symbolic death and survival led the movement to develop a storytelling and writing workshop. At the opening of the workshop, Minerva asked the participants how many of them had met scholars who had traveled from outside of the country to meet and learn about their struggles. And at that point, almost all of the hands in the room were raised. She then asked, how many of you have seen or read the stories that these scholars have written? And then she asked, how many of you have seen these scholars ever again? And at that point, few hands remained. Minerva then stood at the front of the room and stated, it's time for us to tell our own stories. Minerva had encouraged the development of this writing workshop to ensure that the stories of the different members were told as they wanted them to be told. The workshop did not establish any requirements with regards to topics, but what emerged was a web of stories, each one detailing moments of resistance to death by racism. These were fragments of individual lives And yet these stories could be woven together to create a timeline or perhaps a lifeline, highlighting the pain and suffering Black Dominicans of Haitian descent have endured as they fight back against the Dominican state social management of their lives and deaths. I did not have to imagine what parts of their stories should be told because the stories of these individuals now existed as they had chosen for them to be told. Their stories were woven together where the body Angela once described, and each story shared during the workshop was part of Reconocido's organs. So I want to pause here to share my excitement that this past October, our US-based collective, We're All Dominican, and Reconocido celebrated the digital book launch of these stories, which are now available to you all in English online. And I've included this slide from the flyer that we used for the event, which includes the link to the webpage where you can read these stories. If you see at the top left-hand corner, there is the URL is Nos Cambió. So there's a period between the B and the I, and you can log in at any point. And these stories that I'm referring to are available and translated for you to read. And of course, this project was supported with by the Barnard College's Digital Humanities Center and a series of volunteers who committed their time to the translation of these stories. So I now want to turn to the concept of reandando or returning. So one afternoon, I traveled northwest with Angela and Minerva to Monte Plata to meet with Julio. And as you might remember, Julio is the treasurer of the movement who I had mentioned earlier and whose father passed away. And I wanted to know about Julio's father. I wanted to understand why he had decided to return to Haiti after so many years. And so when I got to Monte Plata, I sat on a small bench made for children inside the little school that Julio was responsible for managing in the Batey. And I asked him if he thought his father knew he was dying when he decided to return to visit his family in Haiti. So to this question, Julio responded, and I'm quoting here, "One day he arrives at the house with his packed bag. He gives the keys to his room to my wife, and I ask him, 'Where are you going?' He makes an expression of indifference and leaves. He lasted 3 days with relatives in Barahona before he left for Haiti. Minerva told me that, no, he wanted to die there. But no, I doubt it. He had his medicine and he took it. But the emotion of returning to his village, the excitement of seeing his family again, the excitement of eating again what he used to eat, did not allow him and his illness killed him. He was very excited because when he called my wife, she told me that he sounded very excited, and that made me fearful," end quote. So Julio does not seem to think that his father had planned to die in Haiti, and perhaps the question I had posed and the comments made by Minerva were taken in literal terms. Perhaps he did not intend to die in Haiti, but what does his father's return to Haiti reveal about his imminent death? I want to do some imagining about Julio's father's return to Haiti. So I imagine this return as a form of recognition for him, one that he was not allowed even after working in the sugarcane fields of the Dominican Republic until his retirement, one that had ended his zombification, allowing him to be recognized and return to his family and home. The racist Dominican state had refused to recognize him. His diabetes was most likely the result of limited access to healthy food. He had not allowed the racist state, however, to dictate his death. When I finished talking to Julio that afternoon, Angela invited us to visit her mother. As we drove down the bumpy unpaved road, Angela would point out the different parts of the town that she would have to travel to in order to fetch water, to wash clothes by the river, to gather wood, or take food to her family who was working in the sugarcane fields. And as we were going down this road, Angela explained that all the green areas we were seeing were once full of sugar cane until 2004. And at that point, sugarcane production in the area ceased. The area that we were traveling through seemed to have been taken over by grass now. And as she told us these stories, she chuckled and said that our trip down these roads was a form of returning, or reandando, a spiritual travel experienced by people when they are dying. And the concept of reandando was not new to me. I often heard my mother speak of the loved ones who had come to visit her, signaling their imminent deaths. And, back then I wondered how family members and loved ones who had never left the island could possibly visit our 5-story walk-up in New York City. But suffice to say that at that point in my life, I wasn't really interested in understanding how this happened. But Angela explained that when the body is in the process of dying, the spirit returns to every place it has ever visited. She then laughed and noted that for some people, the process of visiting every place they ever went to would be quite long. I understood her words as also being a commentary on all that she had traveled, marched, and continued to actively fight for. Angela was physically well, and yet this reandando she spoke of was an indication of the spaces of liminality in which Black Dominicans of Haitian descent existed as ghosts, zombies, or muertos civiles. It was this ambiguity that perhaps led her to talk about these travels and experiences in her life as those of someone who is dying or on the way to another form of life. In this process of reandando, our ability to witness and go along with her were also an opportunity for her experience and the Dominican state's attempts at erasure to be recognized. As some of Reconocidos members began accessing their documents, several of them on different occasions traveled to Haiti for the first time ever. Upon their return, they would often share with excitement their experiences meeting family members and grassroots organizers. Many also realized how their experiences as Black subjects in the Dominican Republic differed from those of the Haitian family members, friends, and colleagues they met on their trips. This was shared in reference to their limitations in speaking Creole, their choices in attire, and the food they ate. But I consider these visits to Haiti as a form of reandando as well. Black Dominicans of Haitian descent who are in the process of dying get to visit their parents' or grandparents' home and gain a form of recognition that perhaps no longer marks them as zombies. In their case, however, they return to the Dominican Republic, often reinvigorated and committed to continue fighting for those who remain muertos civiles. So I want to just conclude by talking a little bit about Sonia Pierre. So in 2010, Sonia Pierre, one of the most vocal and well-known Black Dominican women of Haitian descent to actively denounce the denationalization practices of the Dominican state, died of a heart attack. Many say that she died of heartache caused by the Dominican state's constant threats of denationalization against her and her community. Sonia did not live to see the effects of La Sentencia, but her friends and colleagues often wonder how she would have dealt with that blow. Many worried that Sonia's passing would mark a void in the movement, and many contend that there has not been another Sonia since. Such arguments, however, ignore the collective leadership that Black Dominican women, such as Sonia, have fostered. As Sonia stated, she might not make it to the end of the road, but her words continue to travel and return from the sugarcane plantations to Geneva, through the present-day leaders who continue to advocate for their recognition. As Black individuals vulnerable to racial profiling and deportation, at the same time that they are deemed invisible by policies that strip them of their nationality, Dominicans of Haitian descent are constantly negotiating their presence within Dominican society. Through the enactment of racist government policies, they have been rendered zombies, ghosts, and muertos civiles, who are also experiencing alarming rates of physical death. Through their mortuary rituals and practices of remembrance, however, I have argued that the Reconocido movement has also developed strategies to resist against their figurative and physical deaths, transforming the figures of the zombie and muerto civil into undead beings with the possibility to regenerate themselves through their mobilizations and affection for one another. So to conclude, as I begin to work on my next book project, I'm interested in analyzing further the concept of reandando and how narratives of physical and symbolic voyages to ancestral home or homes transform death and immobility narratives within Afro-descendant communities. I'm interested in engaging transnationalism, Black diasporic relationships to the afterworld, as well as the growing literature on the biological effects of racism in the context of the COVID-19 global pandemic. I'm interested in exploring how communities, and particularly its Black women identifying members, are engaging in transnational mutual aid efforts to reimagine and redefine communal practices of care and belonging. So I'll end here, and I look forward to your questions during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Give a virtual applause here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Estrella. This is a really fascinating talk and just presentation, and especially engagement on Blackness and the social death of Black Dominicans of Haitian descent. I appreciated your work, and especially on the possibility of life through the engagement of ghosts. Your engagement with Christina Sharp's wake work, and I have to say, probably some of some of the sharpest employments of Christina Sharp's wake work I've come across, and in particular to think through how reconocidos might be a lens, if you will, into imagining new living despite Black death, as you put it. Yeah, so I've long been interested in myself, just more anecdotally, in the experiences of Haitians in the Dominican Republic and the racialized formations and experiences. So I think your talk gives such nice context and backdrop, and even current interventions around how folks are struggling on the ground with the questions around policies and the ways in which policies are actually constituting citizenship, constituting their bodies, and even one might even say a kind of juridical political act of constituting even their humanity. I do wonder about how human rights discourse plays into this, particularly given how one might think about the ways in which this is in fact the constitution of humanity in and of itself. So how human rights discourse also has a kind of liberal politics more globally, and how this might play itself out within this context, specifically within this discourse specifically. I'm also reminded of Avery Gordon's work here, and the disjunctures between social institutions and the everyday, and how this not only points to a haunting, but more specifically a seething presence that demands a response and even responsibility. And I love reandando. I love the concept of reandando, and even thinking through that as a process. Even I don't know if conjuring is maybe is another way of thinking through that, but yeah, I actually want to even hear you talk more and speak more and even read more for myself on that. I'm going to there's some questions here, so I'm going to turn over, and I see Jerry Berman has a question. So they say they have a fascinating study. Might you tell us more, particularly for those of us who have not undertaken such studies, what processes you followed in order to locate your informants/respondents, and whether there is a way to understand how representative of the larger group of Haitians in DR?
Great. So thank you so much. And I can go back to some of your comments, and I'll go ahead and answer this first question. So I think this is great because it also allows me to talk about some of my previous life work. So prior to being in academia, I was part of a nonprofit organization that funded grassroots movements and organizations on the ground in many countries, but in particular, I was working with grassroots organizers in the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And some of the questions that led me to go into academia are a result of that experience. And a lot of it was this question of, what is the engagement with human rights? What are the power dynamics in these sort of global North, global South relationships? And I wanted to really think about that further. And so I have to say that I already had some connection to these grassroots organizers. I didn't actually know Reconocido specifically. So I did have to do the work of getting to know the leaders, to explain, what sort of work I was interested in, but also being part of the Dominican Black diaspora. We were organizing ourselves from very early on in New York. It started in New York, and most of our members are now in different parts of the US, scholars, activists, artists who were interested in thinking about the dynamics of anti-Haitian sentiment that many of us are also growing up with in our homes, and anti-Blackness, and sort of thinking about how do we have these conversations, and how do we sort of do that work of engaging our families around these questions of anti-Haitian sentiment. And so I think that's sort of the backdrop of how I was really interested in having the space to further understand and support how organizers on the ground were responding to the increasingly draconian laws that were started off as administrative policies, right? And then made their way into the Constitution, and then made their way into this retroactive ruling, right? So it was a decade where policies were progressively limiting the rights of Dominicans of Haitian descent to access their documents. And so the movement itself, in terms of just scope, so they say they have about 500 members. And so I focused primarily on engaging with the movement, but I was also very familiar with other local organizations who were also organizing in different bates of the Dominican Republic. And I mean, the experiences are going to vary. I don't think that I can say that this movement and these experiences are the only experiences, right? I think there are other kinds of dynamics to think about: generational, class, color, that are also going to sort of shape the experiences of Dominicans of Haitian descent in the country. And so for me, it was really important to think about how this particular movement is sort of positioning itself as a human rights movement. And this is going to kind of jump into what you were talking about, and sort of seeing them kind of engaging with this language of denationalization, citizenship, recognition, which is in their name, to then sort of saying, hey, wait a minute, they keep giving us like, these sort of concessions that allow some of us to get citizenship or allow some of us to gain access to particular aspects of what we imagine as Dominican citizenship, but others of us are not, right? And what's happening when that emerges as a sort of tension within the movement itself. And then this realization that even if they had documents, they were still experiencing this kind of racial discrimination, structural racism. And so it was sort of watching the shift also of the discourse on the ground. And so I was kind of interested in what are these limitations that I'm seeing in terms of the human rights discourse? How are folks understanding what human rights is? So is it a discourse that allows you to kind of understand yourself as a bearer of rights? But then what happens beyond that sort of understanding? So then sort of seeing them move into discussions of Black liberation, like what, how are we going to engage Black feminist praxis, theory and praxis, right? Which is actually how Muñecas Negras really develops as well as a project of Reconocido. And so it's been interesting for me to see these tensions, right, in terms of human rights as a discourse that has allowed them to organize and build, right? That also allows them to see themselves as stateless subjects who can connect to other stateless folks around the world, right? So this is part of this kind of shift that I also saw, the sort of connection to statelessness more generally. And to think about, but to think about, well, what are the sort of limitations when we have to talk about anti-Blackness within the sort of global human rights movement that doesn't actually have the space or the language to really even say what is race exactly, right? So I think for me that was really important to sort of capture and to see, and it's definitely been interesting to see that sort of, I guess I can call it a shift in the sort of discourse around what exactly is the movement seeking to achieve as well.
Yeah, I find myself thinking about not just Christina Sharp, but also even De Silva's work, even Moten here, because there's a way in which in the human rights discourse, there is almost inherently a politics of inclusion that has this problematic of reifying the liberal subject of human or the post-Enlightenment subject, and to what extent do we even want to recuperate that subject formation rather than obliterate it and try to move towards some kind of alternative worlding? I think is really fascinating to think through, even in your project here, and how the human rights discourse is being taken up. There's another question here I want to get to. So, as a U.S. citizen of Dominican, this is from Amy Eusebio. As a U.S. citizen of Dominican descent, I'm always floored and embarrassed at anti-Haitian sentiment on the island. I'm also curious how we connect how Dominican government treats Haitians with how American government treats all immigrants, including Dominicans. How does anti-Haitian sentiment change once Dominicans experience US racism and engage in broader Black liberation movements? Great question.
That's a great question, and it's really at the core of a lot of what we as a collective, We Are All Dominican, have been trying to also really work through. So I think one thing I'll say is that it doesn't always translate into Black liberation movements for folks who are moving to the US. And there's many reasons for that. I think, there are some key work that's been done by, sociologists such as Ginetta Candelario around these different kinds of experiences of Blackness and moving to the US, even from like one region or state to the other, but also when we think historically, when these migration patterns are happening, right? So I just kind of want to mention, and I want to note that that there might be somewhat of sometimes it's a generational shift that we see in terms of sort of this sort of connection to Black diaspora activism and sort of denunciations of anti-Haitian sentiment. But what we found was that there was a lot of anti-Haitian sentiment in New York City, right? And that we were holding events where we were inviting members of the movement to come and talk about these issues. And we had ultranationalists like trying to disrupt our events and trying to, talk about how this was treason and defamation, right? And so I think that I don't know that I'm going to give a good answer here. So I just want to say that, but I think that it just, to me, it calls or shows how much work still needs to happen. And that something that I've been thinking about or trying to process as someone who's not of Haitian descent is, what does it look like? What is our responsibility to our families and having these conversations with them as well, right? What does it look like to talk about anti-Haitian sentiment, anti-Blackness? And to both recognize that anti-Blackness and anti-Haitian sentiment, the anti-Blackness is something that we, whether you're of Haitian descent or not, are need to talk about, are potentially experiencing in the Dominican Republic, right? But that there has to be a lot of work that has to be done to get there. And I guess that's the part that I want to kind of highlight, that we as a collective have really tried to do that hard work of saying, how do you talk to your mother, to your aunt, to your grandparents about what is the impact within our families, and also in the larger Dominican society. And so I don't, I think my it's sort of like we're working on it. I think that's my response. We're working on it, and I think it takes a lot because I think that work can feel harder to do, and it takes a lot of energy also, especially if you're already coming from this with a sort of Black liberation framework. And for us as a collective, so much of our work has been around like Black diaspora dialogue and trying to figure out how are we, organizing and creating transnational networks. So I appreciate the question, and I hope I'm being helpful in some way.
I think your response was both great and beautiful, because you gave context and also the need for so acknowledging what needs to be done. So, and sometimes that's enough right there. So I appreciate the response, at least for myself. So we have, and Amy also added, she said, thank you. I'd love to get involved in the collective and grapple with these issues. How can I learn more? So I don't know if you want to respond to that.
So very quickly, there are a few ways you can go on Instagram or Facebook and find Reconocido, and also We Are All Dominican. But I also put my email in the chat because I'm happy to just, answer any questions that might come up as well, that I'm happy to just do the connecting around.
Go ahead, no, please.
I have one last thing to say, which is your Andando part, and it's the part that I'm really excited to kind of think through. So I've one thing that I've been thinking about is, what is this kind of witnessing also that happens in the Andando as a scholar? To think about Andando support of and creating space for the experiences of Dominicans of Haitian descent. And also for it to be a kind of space for us to think about what does it mean to walk together in this process. So just some thoughts because I wanted to go back to that comment you had made.
Thank you. This has been extremely fascinating and engaging talk and just discussion. I want to also thank our audience for joining us and for such great questions this evening as well. I hope you all will join us for future New Directions talks, as well as other Africana Studies programs this semester. And please visit the Center for Africana Studies website for program details and registration information. Amarilys, Estrella, thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating and energizing and engaging, and not only just providing a history and context and engagement, but also what's potential, what's actually potentially in the horizon for reshaping for the kind of wake work that you're pointing to. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you again. It was a pleasure.
Now, I actually had other questions for you, and maybe I'll just email them to you, but this was really good. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, I'm more than happy to either pick it up via email or, you know, if you want to schedule some Zoom time, I'm always down for that too.
We could do that. We could do that. Yeah. Your take up and use of Christina Sharp was definitely, like I said, it was really both fabulous and sharp in take up. And there was just some things I was curious about and thinking through Sharp through your project. That would be great to talk through. So yeah, I'll shoot you an email. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. It was such a pleasure to meet you, Ezekiel. And thank you
as
again.
Well. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night, Ezekiel.